Please turn your attention to our interpretation team.
Sí, muy buenas tardes. Hi, good afternoon. Mi nombre es Abraham y junto con Karin estaremos interpretando el día de hoy. I'll be giving these instructions in Spanish and then in English. Para aquellos que no son bilingües, pueden seleccionar su canal de idiomas en el globo al pie de su pantalla. Si están aquí ustedes con un teléfono inteligente o una tableta, van a ver 3 puntitos que dicen más. Pueden seleccionar el globo terráqueo, los 3 puntitos, seleccionar español, poner finalizado. Cualquier pregunta o inconveniente, favor de dejarnos saber a través de la caja chat y no sufran en silencio. Asegúrese de participar en el idioma que hayan seleccionado. Ahora doy estas instrucciones en inglés. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Abraham, and along with Karin, we'll be providing interpretation from English to Spanish, Spanish to English. For those of you who are not fully bilingual, you can select a language channel. If you are here with a computer, you'll see a globe at the bottom of your screen. If you are here with a cell phone or tablet, you'll see 3 dots that say More. You can select the globe or select the 3 dots, select English, and make sure to hit Done. If you have any difficulties with the interpretation, please let us know through the chat. Thank you so much, and back to you all.
Thank you so much, Abe. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and many thanks to our interpretation team. I'm Peri Branco, Director of Technical Assistance with the National Resources Center on Domestic Violence. I'm wearing a red sweater and yellow gold jewelry. I have brown skin and shoulder-length curly hair. Today, I'm joined from the land of the Katuaba, Shira, and Sugari people. Before we begin, we would like to review some brief housekeeping notes with you. As you use the chat and Q&A features during this webinar, please be mindful of privacy and accessibility issues. Do not share sensitive or confidential information in the chat, and as much as possible, the presenters and chat monitor will read aloud comments or questions for interpretation in order to offer a more accessible experience for all webinar participants. This event features live captioning. You can access this feature by clicking the Show Captions icon at the bottom of your screen. Yes, we are recording the event, and we'll send you the recording to all participants as soon as it becomes available. Finally, please reach out to our staff if you are experiencing any accessibility or technical issues, and we do our best to help. Welcome to today's webinar, The Hidden Costs of Financial Abuse and Fraud in Domestic Violence. Next slide, please. This webinar will highlight the intersections of financial fraud, financial abuse, and domestic violence. It will also cover the emotional and financial impact on survivors and offer concrete tools and resources to advocates who are helping survivors navigate this challenge. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. Whether this is your first NRCDV webinar or you are a long-time supporter, we welcome you today. NRCDV provides a wide range of free, comprehensive, and individualized technical assistance, training, and specialized resources materials. Our mission is to strengthen and transform efforts to end domestic violence. We do so by collaborating with other organizations and partners to offer the field a strong, robust expertise, backgrounds, and perspectives. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is an exciting partnership with the National Center for Victims of Crime and the FINRA's Investors Education Foundation. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's presenters, Kim Camacho and Robert Mascio. Kim Camacho, MSW, is a Deputy Director at the National Center for Victims of Crime, where she oversees several key projects under the Center for Victim Service Professionals. Robert Mascio is the Director of Investor Education Outreach at FINRA, where he cultivates and manages programs and partnerships related to investor protection and the prevention of financial fraud and exploitation. You can see their full bios are being shared in the chat for your reference. And without further delay, the floor is yours, Kim and Rob.
Thank you so much, Patty. Good morning or afternoon to all of you. We are very excited to be here. As Patty mentioned, my name is Kim Camacho. I am a white woman and I have medium-length curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue and white striped top today. As Patty mentioned, I have my background is in social work. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in social work. I currently do training and technical assistance on a number of different kind of topic areas for victim service professionals, ranging from advocates to law enforcement, prosecutors, folks in the healthcare field, and others. And so one of our partnerships and projects is with the FINRA Foundation, and we do quite a bit of education for folks around topics related to financial fraud and scams. And this particular intersection that we're talking about today is very near and dear to my heart. My background is primarily in the anti-violence field, and so addressing domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, trafficking, and harassment. I have had experience as both a victim advocate on a campus, as well as doing campus violence prevention work, and training and technical assistance at the national level. I had the pleasure of working at NRCDV before coming to NCVC. So I'm very excited to be here. Next slide, please. So we want to get to know all of you. Thank you for those of you that have started to introduce yourselves in the chat. But we'd love to know kind of who's joining us today. So feel free to share your name, maybe the agency or role that you hold, and where you're joining from. I am joining from Sacramento, California today. Feel free to continue to put things in the chat. I see someone from Boise, Idaho. That's where I'm from, so nice to see you. And next slide, please. So really quickly, I just wanted to share a little bit about the National Center for Victims of Crime. Our mission is to forge a national commitment to help victims. We are dedicated to serving individuals, families, and communities that are harmed by crime. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary, and we were really founded through one family's tragedy. Our founder's mother, Sunny Van Bulow, was murdered, and it was through their family's experiences with the criminal justice system that our organization was born. And we continue to do quite a bit of work across a lot of different victimization types. We provide direct services through our Victim Connect Resource Center hotline, and we also do a lot of training and resource development, and you'll get to see a little bit more of that in this next video. Next slide, please.
I'm Renee Williams, Executive Director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. Each year, millions of Americans become victims of crime. Their voices have often gone unheard, and their needs have taken a back seat in the criminal justice system. Born in 1985 out of one family's tragedy as the Sunny Van Bulow National Victim Advocacy Center, our mission is to create a better world for victims and survivors. And we've been busy for the past 38 years, changing the conversation about victims' rights, working on landmark legislation and policies, and creating resources and tools to help advocates and justice professionals better serve victims. We're still going strong because the need is so great. We offer direct support and resources to victims, with more than 19,000 people assisted in 2022 alone. We help get financial support to victims and family members of mass violence, We help victims pursue civil justice. We help connect Native survivors of crime and abuse to resources, and we continue to educate and train professionals and the public on victim-centered practices. We're not stopping anytime soon. We're committed to expanding access to resources in rural and tribal areas, changing the tone about polyvictimization and addressing trauma holistically, pushing for criminal justice reform that heals and involves the needs of survivors, and creating better access to the legal system for all victims. And like always, elevating the conversation.
Great. Next slide. I'll turn it over to Rob.
I'm Renee.
Great. Thank you, Kim. And thank you all for joining us today. Looking forward to this conversation. My name is Rob Massio. As was mentioned, I'm a director with an organization called FINRA, and I will go through and explain who that is. But just as everybody else has, for those of you out there, I am a white male with short brown hair, light colored shirt, and a gray jacket. All right, so FINRA. FINRA stands for the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. We are a self-regulatory organization that is responsible for regulating brokerage firms. So when you think about buying and selling securities, that would typically fall under our type of jurisdiction. Our mission within FINRA is investor protection and market integrity, and we go about that through a variety of different channels within our organization. My background focuses primarily on financial fraud. That is my area of expertise, which brings us to our FINRA Foundation. Our FINRA Foundation is a subsidiary of FINRA, and we are, through the FINRA Foundation, we focus on financial capabilities for all Americans. And we do that through really two distinct pillars, one focusing on building wealth, the other focusing on protecting wealth. And through our foundation, we hold outreach events, we work with a variety of different partners, we conduct research around financial capability and components of financial fraud. And as we go through today, I'll share some of those research projects with you all as we tie everything into some of the research we've done. Next slide.
So this is where we're headed today in our conversation. We're going to talk about the intersections of financial fraud, financial abuse, and intimate partner violence. And we're going to talk about the impacts that particularly fraud and other financial crimes have on victims. Not only the financial impact, but also talking about more of the emotional impact. And then we'll share some different steps, tools, and resources for folks that might be assisting victims as it relates to fraud and other types of financial abuse or crimes. And I did see in the chat someone asking if the information today will apply for Canada. Some of the information and resources we will share are kind of specific to the United States, but I think a lot of the information is applicable outside as well. So we hope that you'll gain some information here, whether you're joining from the US or from other places. Next slide, please. So in the chat, I'm just curious to know how often those of you joining are supporting domestic violence victims or survivors with financial abuse or other financial types of crime. So are you always helping? Are you noticing that that always is coming up for you when you're working with a victim or survivor? Sometimes, rarely, never. See a lot of responses coming into the chat. That's great. Okay. So quite a few in the like always and sometimes category. I'm seeing folks respond in the chat as well. We have a lower percentage of rarely or never, but overall it looks like a majority of folks are finding that this is happening with the folks that you're working with. Right. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with just talking a little bit about the differences between financial fraud, financial abuse, how they intersect with domestic violence. And we'll start with some kind of basic info for those of you that may not be familiar and may not be working specifically in the domestic violence space. Next slide, please. Just so for all of us to be on the same page and understanding just how prevalent domestic violence is, we recognize that people of all identities and backgrounds are impacted by domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And according to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, about 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So that's pretty significant. So even if you're not directly working in the domestic violence space, it's likely that you're engaging with clients or other folks that you're serving that have had these experiences at some point in their lifetime. We know that domestic violence can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological, or even technological actions or threats of actions that create a pattern of behavior that influences another person, typically with the ultimate goal of gaining and maintaining power and control over that person. We know that financial abuse is very prevalent in abusive relationships. In fact, the National Network to End Domestic Violence found that 99% of domestic violence cases have experienced financial abuse in some form. It can be perpetrated in a number of ways, and it often creates really significant barriers for victims and survivors to be able to safely exit relationships. And as you'll see, it has a lot of impacts that are both immediate and long-term. Next slide, please. So we know that financial fraud and financial abuse are very related concepts, and there's a lot of intersections and overlap. And we wanted to kind of provide a little bit of a distinction between the two and recognize that both of these could be happening in the context of domestic violence. So for financial fraud, the primary kind of motivation for perpetrating this is ultimately financial gain. It's intentionally deceiving a victim by misrepresenting, concealing, or omitting facts about maybe goods that were promised, services, or benefits, again, for that ultimate goal of financial gain. Financial abuse in the context of domestic violence and intimate partner violence is really a tactic that is used to gain and maintain power and control in a relationship. Both can be used, and again, they're very interrelated concepts, but we're going to kind of explore some different types of what we might consider financial abuse and then how financial fraud might show up in an abusive relationship. Next slide, please. Well, this is not an exhaustive list of financial abuse. We would probably be here all day if we talked about every single type of financial abuse. We wanted to provide just a few examples. And if you've been working in the domestic violence field, you're likely very familiar with these tactics. And we welcome you to share others in the chat that you may have experienced when working with a survivor. And so one of those might be preventing their partner from holding a job. Having worked on a college campus, we would also have, students that would experience their partner trying to prevent them from accessing higher education or kind of sabotaging that. As you see in the next bullet point, they might sabotage work or employment opportunities, so taking their car keys so that they can't get to work on time. They might be causing disruptions at their workplace, like showing up and causing a scene or constantly calling their workplace. And so those are maybe less obvious kind of tactics, but ways that they might be preventing or making it very difficult for their partner to have access to income or even educational opportunities that would allow them to hold a better job and have more financial independence. It can also include things like controlling how money is spent or restricting access to the money, refusing to pay bills, and ultimately ruining their credit score. which we'll talk about later, can have pretty significant long-term effects. I'm seeing in the chat a couple of additional kind of examples, continuing to litigate in a divorce so that the perpetrator doesn't have to pay, right? Or just forcing the victim to rack up legal fees as well. Using attorneys to assist in the abuse by blaming the victim, confusing them in court, hiding money, not paying child support. So these are really great examples. Concealing assets and not letting them know what kinds of assets or income they might have. Yeah, these are great. Next slide, please. So then we get into types of financial fraud. And again, there are many types of fraud and scams that are out there. We do whole presentations on those, so that we won't cover all of them today, but we wanted to highlight some that are more likely to intersect with domestic violence. So stealing a victim's identity, their property, or inheritance. So either through coercion, or just taking it. This can also extend to children. And so the perpetrator may be stealing the children's using their identity, or taking maybe savings that was meant for them, a college fund, things like that. Opening a credit card in the survivor's name, right? Again, like impacting their credit, especially if they're not paying off the credit card. They might be also forcing the victim to write bad checks or file fraudulent tax returns, filing false insurance claims, forcing them to turn over their public benefits. They might start a business under a victim's name, force them to sign legal paperwork in a language that the victim doesn't understand. They might also force them to sign a power of attorney or give up control of their assets, or forcing them to allow them to make kind of decisions on their behalf as it relates to finances. And there's also this idea of coerced debt. And so this is a situation where a perpetrator would, again, kind of force or coerce the victim into doing things that will impact their debt and then ultimately their credit. So demanding that all assets be in their name and all the debts are maybe in the victim's name, forcing them to take out a loan or sign other financial documents, incurring large debts on joint accounts that they're both a part of, refusing to pay bills or running up kind of the utilities potentially in the victim's name. So things like requiring that the thermostat is set to a particular temperature, even if that means that their bill is going to be really high. Refinancing mortgages or loans without the victim's knowledge or consent. Repeatedly filing costly lawsuits. So we kind of talked about how the legal system can be used by perpetrators, and coercing the victim to give up any assets that they might hold outside of the relationship. So there's quite a few. Rob, do you have any other examples to add there?
No, I think you did a great job covering a broad number of them.
Great. Well, next slide, I think, is you. So I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. So these are some of the tactics that are often used when individuals are looking to manipulate and coerce you into doing something that you might not do under normal circumstances. So in the financial fraud world, we call these weapons of fraud, but these tactics, they are essentially emotional manipulation tactics that are used by a variety of different types of individuals. Some of these you might even see as marketing tactics, but I'll go through and explain a little bit about how some of these work. So the first one is phantom riches. And this one is going to focus more on the picture of high return. So if you think about it from an investment standpoint, dangling that prospect of wealth or the ability to make a significant return, words and terms such as risk-free and guaranteed are often used. And again, we'll see this a lot of times in more of investment type of scams and frauds. The next one is social consensus. And this one is a play where everybody else is doing it, so you think to yourself, well, maybe I should as well. So if you think about this from a marketing standpoint, there are fast food restaurants that have on their billboard, billions served, right? That's showing you that billions of people have eaten at this restaurant. You should consider doing it too. So social consensus is a tactic that is often used, and it convinces you to move in a certain direction because other people are allegedly doing it as well. The next one is source credibility. And there's a reason why at the beginning of this webinar, Kim and I had our bios read. They were put in the chat. That's to make us and to show you all that we are credible, right? When there is credibility, it's kind of that shortcut to trust. It makes you think that we know what we're talking about, right? So we go through our bios so you all know this is where we come from. This is the type of work that we're experts in, to have you all then start to listen to us. Now, source credibility, it is that shortcut to trust, but it can easily be faked, right? So if you're talking to someone, they can easily pretend to be somebody that they aren't. They can come up with a backstory or a background to meet your specific desires, or they can dress a certain way to make them appear more successful. So that source credibility tactic, it is a shortcut to trust, but it can easily be faked. The next tactic here is reciprocity. And reciprocity is that concept of, I'm going to do something for you, something small, most likely for you, in hopes that you do something for me. If you think about, a lot of people are familiar with these kind of like free lunch type of events where we offer you a free lunch, you come in and you listen to whatever the presentation might be. That is using reciprocity. That is convincing you to, okay, I'm going to come to this free lunch, and the person that's putting the event on hopes that you feel, okay, maybe I should listen. Maybe I should give this person a chance. Maybe I should invest some money, or whatever it may be. They're giving you that free lunch in hopes of something in return. That's how reciprocity works. And then the last one is scarcity. And scarcity is a tactic that gets us to act quickly based off of a limited quantity of something or a limited amount of time that you have to respond or to act. These are plays that get us in a heightened state of emotion that make us want to act quick so we don't miss out, so we don't not take advantage of that opportunity. That's how scarcity works. And if you think about, if anybody's ever seen an infomercial, right, where a product is being sold, scarcity is a tactic that they use on infomercials. They show that there's a certain product that's running out. There's only a certain number, a certain quantity left. They tell you that this is a limited opportunity. You have to buy now, or else you're going to miss out on getting this product. That is scarcity, and that's how scarcity works.
And I would just add, while these tactics are used by all different types of perpetrators, right? Strangers or acquaintances, in the context of domestic violence, right? An abusive partner might also use similar tactics as a way to pressure their partner into doing, something that they might not otherwise want to do. So I just wanted to highlight that as well.
Exactly, perfect. All right, next slide, please. Now so I mentioned that the FINRA Foundation, we do research around different topics, and financial fraud is one of those topics that we do a significant amount of research on. And these factors that relate to engagement, these applied specifically to reports that were made to an organization called the Better Business Bureau, and they collect customer complaints and fraud and scam concerns and complaints, we leveraged that database to conduct some research and some studies. And what we were trying to do is we really wanted to understand what separated victims from non-victims and what caused individuals to potentially engage when faced with a potential opportunity. And so while these do tie, the research was based around financial fraud, these could also apply to certain domestic violence type situations as well, or intimate partner type situations. So what we saw, factors that led to engagement, a higher level of engagement, we found that individuals who were financially insecure were more likely to engage. So financial insecurity means living paycheck to paycheck, or not having an emergency fund, that maybe $2,000 to emergency fund for if your car breaks down or whatever it might be. That would be considered financially insecure. There's also social isolation, which played a role. And this could be isolation in the sense that the person physically had nobody to talk to. They were isolated in the sense that we often think about. No network of friends or family to lean on and to leverage. The other kind of social isolation is individuals that maybe they have that network, but they put themselves in a state of social isolation. So they decide not to engage with their community, with their friend base, with their family when it comes to certain situations. In this particular study, it was when presented with a financial fraud, an opportunity that was fraudulent. The last method, the last level that leads to higher levels of engagement is the method in which individuals were targeted. And we found when it came to financial fraud that individuals that were targeted through online means were more likely to engage. Now, the other side of the scale here, the lower levels of engagement, one of the biggest protective factors that we identified was knowledge. And I think this transcends across multiple different disciplines. But the more we know about something, the more we know, for example, about frauds and scams, the tactics that are used, the manipulation tactics, the better protected we can be. The quicker we'll be able to identify those types of tactics and manipulations and be able to avoid certain situations. So knowledge is a key component when it comes to fighting fraud. All right, next slide. Now, I mentioned this already a little bit, that role of social isolation. This just, again, breaks down those two different types of isolation. Those that did not have anybody available to discuss with, but then those that place themselves in a state of social isolation. So it's important to remember that there are multiple types of isolation. Some are ones that we put ourselves in, other ones are ones that we might not have a control over.
I would just add, as many of you know, victims or survivors that are experiencing domestic violence are also likely going to be very isolated, right? That's another tactic of abuse. And so they likely are not going to have the kind of support systems to talk with about the financial abuse or, exposure to scams or other fraud that they're navigating, and the abusive partner might not be someone that they can safely engage with either. So I think the isolation piece is especially prominent when we're working with domestic violence victims.
And I think through even just conversations I've had with Kim, again, my expertise is in the financial fraud space, whereas Kim has more of that background in intimate partner violence and domestic violence. So we see that oftentimes individuals who are victimized or targeted in one discipline then can be targeted and exposed to other types of disciplines as well. So it might be a domestic violence type situation, but then financial fraud comes in either through the abuser or through another means because you are in that state of vulnerability. And when it comes to financial fraud, vulnerability is often what leads to victimization. It's something that creates a moment of vulnerability for you. And there's lots of different ways that that can happen. A domestic violence situation could set you up for that, where you are more susceptible to potentially engaging with an individual who is looking to defraud you. All right, we'll move on to the next slide here. So this comes from another study, another research project that we focused on, and we worked on this one with AARP, and we wanted to focus on chronic fraud victimization. So I mentioned a little bit about how victims can be exposed to a variety of different types of manipulation. If you're in a domestic violence situation, you could be exposed then to a financial fraud situation. So this model, I think, applies. We were again focusing on chronic fraud victimization and trying to understand what makes somebody continually to engage in a certain situation that might be fraudulent. And this could be, so we define chronic fraud as repeatedly being victimized by the same kind of fraud or by a variety of different types of frauds. And when we think about the different components that makes a person vulnerable, there have to be certain areas that have to happen. So we have this wheel on the slide here that talks about certain different quadrants. We've got the situation, we've got the trigger, we've got motivation, and we have ability. And I'll walk through what these kind of mean. And from this study, we were looking to see how we could potentially disrupt this cycle. So on the first part, the situation, that is kind of that catalyst that kickstarts the whole process. So if we're thinking about maybe a romance scam type of situation, the death of a spouse or loss of a spouse could be that situation that kind of starts the whole process. Then we move over to the trigger. The trigger is the moment of contact. So it might be that message from an individual through a dating app, or it might be a phone call, whatever it may be, that starts again this fraud wheel in motion. The motivation, that might be that desire to be wanted, to be loved, to be taken care of, that you're looking to try to fulfill. And then the last component is ability, and that's simply the ability to access funds. So for this fraud cycle to happen, these 4 different quadrants are likely going to be met. And we were looking for ways that we can kind of disrupt. So on the situation side, what can we do to really tackle chronic susceptibility, people that are in a certain type of situation? From the trigger standpoint, what kind of interventions or education can we put in place? From the motivation, anybody that's in a social support type of capacity, this is a role that you can play. By having conversations with an individual, you can help fulfill that motivation, help fulfill that need that the individual is seeking to obtain, and they'll get it from you as opposed to an abuser or an individual that's looking to take advantage of you. And then the ability, how can we put certain buffers in place and slow down that transaction, slow down that ability to access funds? And if anybody's interested in learning more about some of the projects or the research that we've done, this information is all on our website. It's finrafoundation.org.
Rob, before we head to the next slide, we have a question in the Q&A that I think is somewhat related here.
Sure.
That asked, if these individuals are isolated, how do we help find them to provide them with information and getting help, especially if they're not on like social media or etc. I'm happy to jump in and then let you kind of add anything else. I think this is where, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but this is where I think your community partnerships play a really important role, right? And helping getting this information out to your partners that might be engaging with folks in different capacities, right? And thinking really creatively and outside the box about who those partners are. Engaging community leaders. So are you connected with affinity groups in your community, religious groups, your law enforcement partners, prosecutors, other people that might come in contact with victims, and including information about financial abuse, financial fraud, in the work that you're currently doing. So where can you find that overlap in those intersections? And how can you get that information out in the work that you're already doing? So that would be kind of where I would go, and thinking just about how do I engage other partners in this work, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that later. But Rob, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, I think those are great points, Kim, that you covered. It's hard to be able to reach everybody, but we have to start somewhere. So taking that first step and trying to expand that network of community support, I think is a great step to take. All right, move on here to the next slide. All right, Kim, is this one? Oh, no, this is still the impact. Okay. So we've talked about a few of the different research projects that the FINRA Foundation has done. I'm going to just share a little bit of the impact of financial fraud. So on that next slide, when we move forward here, one of the things when it comes to financial fraud and financial abuse that often goes overlooked is that non-financial cost associated. And again, the FINRA Foundation, we did a study where we looked at victims of fraud, and we found that nearly 2/3 of victims of financial fraud experienced at least one serious non-financial cost associated with fraud. So this could show up in looking like severe stress, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, depression. And this isn't just, I had a bad night's sleep yesterday. This is to a chronic level. This is continual difficulty sleeping or continual anxiety and stress. So this is something that's really important if we're playing a supporting role, to remember that, yes, the money lost is important, but it's equally as important to remember those non-financial costs, those non-financial impacts that individuals face. All right, next slide. One of the other groups that we work with, one of the partners that we work with, so I mentioned that we work with Kim at the National Center for Victims of Crime. We also work with an organization called Give an Hour, and they are a national nonprofit in the mental health space. They do a lot of different types of work. We partnered with them to focus on the emotional impact of financial fraud. And one of the things that we did is we did a review of social media posts to understand the emotions that fraud victims were expressing online. And some of the interesting things that we saw, and you can see on this timeline here, is the various different types of emotions experienced. So if we start at that 0 to 3 months post-fraud, you're seeing things like isolation, embarrassment, guilt. Now, if you fast forward to 9 to 12 months after that fraud event, we're still seeing individuals that are experiencing these strong emotional impacts. They're expressing feelings like terror, lack of trust, exhaustion, depression. So 9 to 12 months after that fraud event, we're still seeing these significant emotional impacts. So question on the slide is financial fraud, is fraud victimization traumatic? The answer is absolutely. It is traumatic. And individuals experience trauma in different ways. But through this comb of social media posts, we saw that this is a very traumatic experience, and it lasts for a significant amount of time. All right, next slide.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I think one of the things we see is that financial victimization can be just as traumatic as, violent crime or other types of crime. And if we're thinking about this in the context of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, right, there's oftentimes going to be other types of trauma or other types of experiences that the victim is having that also adds to, lots of layers of trauma and the impacts of that. So, we, like Rob mentioned, a lot of times we really focus on, the impact of financial crimes really being that monetary loss. But it's really important for us to recognize that the impacts really extend well beyond kind of that immediate financial fallout. So we know that survivors might experience really long-term effects to their credit score, for example, which then in turn, right, affects other things. So their ability to take out a loan, secure permanent housing, right? They may not be able to rent an apartment or a house if their credit score is not good. They might not have, again, going back to isolation, they may not have anyone that could co-sign on a loan or on a rental. And so that creates some additional barriers for them to safely leave the relationship. It could prevent them from buying a car, right? Again, so another kind of piece of things in the puzzle is not having access to transportation. And so it just really can impact their ability to kind of rebuild their lives. Survivors can also experience legal issues, as many of you have highlighted in the chat, particularly, if their identity has been stolen or misused. The abusive partner may have been committing other crimes using their partner's identity. Or they might, that victim might have kind of potential liability for other fraudulent activities that were happening in the context of domestic violence. And I've seen some folks kind of putting in the chat as well, even victims having access to legal representation and the financial cost that comes with. And one thing that I think continues to be a barrier in many communities is that while domestic violence programs may have some level of legal services that they're able to provide victims, at the end of the day, a lot of times it's pretty limited in terms of what they can provide and offer. And so there's generally just a lack of resources and support as victims are navigating financial, abuse and harm, that they can access. We've talked about, the emotional impacts. It's ultimately another way that their trust has been broken. And it can really leave victims and survivors feeling trapped, and continue to negatively affect their kind of life long after the abuse has ended. And as we've mentioned, there are a lot of barriers for them to be able to leave if they don't have access to income, if their credit is not good, if they have legal issues. All of these things kind of add up and make it very difficult. Next slide, please. So one thing we always talk about is that language is a really powerful tool and it can really impact a survivor's healing journey. So for those of you that are doing work in the anti-violence or domestic violence field, you're likely very familiar with using kind of trauma-informed language when you're engaging survivors and when you're talking about gender-based violence. Unfortunately, as a society, we don't often do the same for victims that are experiencing financial crimes. So we haven't really caught up there. And so if you consider even how people react to things like property crimes, right? If they have something stolen from them, people are typically believed, and people recognize that it wasn't their fault, and they didn't deserve what happened to them. So we have some examples of that on the slide. They didn't deserve that. I want to help. But often when we talk about fraud, and you'll really see this if you ever catch like a news story about scams, that the language that we're using are things like they fell for it. They fell for that scam. I can't believe you fell for that. How did you fall for that? Or we ask questions that maybe place, blame on the victim. Why would you give them so much money? Why would you allow that person access to that information? Which can be particularly difficult in an intimate partner relationship, right? Because again, they may have trusted that person. If they're living, in the same home, they have generally more access to that information. And so that can be especially challenging. So we just like to remind folks to be really mindful and intentional about the language that we're using because it does matter. And it can ultimately support recovery for victims, or it can inadvertently cause more harm. Next slide, please. So these are just a few examples of things that people might kind of immediately think to say and how we could maybe shift that a little bit. So, we a lot of times when we talk about scams, we like to say if it's too good to be true, that's a good indication that it's a scam, right? And if someone has already experienced a financial crime, that's probably not very helpful in that moment. And so how do we flip that to what the scammers are doing, or maybe what their partner was doing, right? They're using really powerful emotional tactics. They are manipulating, or they're exploiting a vulnerability, like Rob mentioned before. In the case where it might be a stranger, why did you give a stranger your money, right? We might ask instead, what did they say to deceive you and build your trust? So we want to get away from implying any blame, because ultimately that really contributes to someone's feelings around shame, which can prevent them from coming forward, getting support. The reality, especially with financial fraud and scams, is that people often feel a level of shame, kind of regardless. And so we want to really show empathy. We want to empower victims. We don't want to add to that blame and shame that they are likely already experiencing. We can also say things like, you were targeted. It's just a powerful acknowledgement that, again, places the responsibility back on the person that perpetrated the crime, which is where it belongs. Helping people know that this is not your fault. This was a betrayal of trust. So when you're working particularly with domestic violence survivors, I think that's a really important thing to continue to communicate is this was another way that they've betrayed your trust, and another way that they have, manipulated you or exploited you in order to maintain kind of power and control over you. So we really want to build that opportunity for healing and self-compassion. And it can also be hard to know what questions are helpful to ask, particularly in the context of financial harm. And so just being kind of open-ended, right? Just like we would ask about other types of experiences and crimes, we can say, are you able to tell me a little bit more about that? Where would you like to start? Do you remember anything else? What were your thoughts when you heard about this offer? Or, tell me about your thoughts leading up to reporting, to kind of tap into what's their self kind of internal talk? What things are they worried about? What were maybe some potential barriers? What were they thinking as they thought about reporting that or accessing help and support? All right, next slide, please. So we're going to start to get into how do we respond to this? And I know there's been some different kind of questions about that. What do we do? What resources are available? So that's where we're headed next. Next slide.
So to start off, we've mentioned it already, but this whole concept of knowledge is power. The more we talk about different situations and things that are happening and types of frauds that are occurring, types of abuse, the more protected we all can be. So the less likely we'll engage in a certain situation simply by knowing about the tactics used. That's why we spent time talking about those types of tactics, because the more we know, the better protected we can be, the more likely we can avoid certain types of situations. So knowledge truly is power. Next slide.
Yeah, so one of the, things that I think continues to come up is this idea around what Rob just talked about. Knowledge is power, having information is really essential. And so that also extends to all of us as service providers, right? Whether we're in a domestic violence program or maybe we're doing similar work. It's really important that we are familiar with the types of financial abuse and fraud that might impact those that we're working with, right? So you're already one step ahead. You're here at this webinar and learning more, but staying apprised of what are the common kind of scams and fraud that are out there. It's something that prior to doing this work, it was something that as a social worker was not something that was very well introduced into my professional development. And so I think it's really important that we are aware of it. I actually really like this example of a victim that we have worked with in this space that talked about, he was working with a social worker through grief after his partner had died. And unfortunately, he was targeted by a scammer. And the social worker had been encouraging him to get out and go meet people. And he unfortunately was targeted by someone that was perpetrating a romance scam. And so had that social worker had a little bit more information about maybe the red flags or warning signs to look for, they may have been able to kind of identify that as a scam earlier on. And support that person. So regardless of the work that you do, if you're engaging with folks, this is something that might come up. And so just being really familiar with the type of tactics like Rob talked about, the ways that it intersects with the different types of crime that we might be working with folks around, and being familiar with the resources that are out there. And as well as building those relationships and partnerships can help us to feel a little bit more prepared when financial crimes kind of come up in the context of us supporting them. Another thing that we can do to respond, right, is we've talked a lot about this, but providing emotional support, just like you would any other type of abuse, and recognizing that that particular piece can also come with a lot of emotions, as Rob highlighted in that graphic a few slides back. So identifying mental health supports, such as counseling. One thing we found to be really helpful for really victims of all kind of crime types, but in particular around fraud and scams, is peer support. And we'll have some really awesome resources to share before the end of the presentation about peer support groups that are really geared towards victims of financial crimes. And that can be a really great resource for them as they figure out, one, how to navigate life after that victimization, but also get that really important support from others that are going through something similar. Recovery and healing, we know, is not linear. And we can really make an impact by approaching a survivor with care and support. And I think one of the really important things that, again, has, I think, been kind of highlighted in the conversation in the chat is that recovery from financial abuse and fraud can be a really complex journey for many. The reality is that even if it's perpetrated by a stranger or an acquaintance, full recovery of financial losses from fraud is really rare for a lot of different reasons. And then when you add in this context of it being an intimate partner, right, there can be some really challenging barriers for victims to, one, get that money back, to rebuild their credit following that harm. So it's important that we as service providers are framing recovery as a holistic approach. That we're not just focusing on the financial loss, but that we're also taking into account all of the other supports that a person might need outside of that. We know that victims often need support and resources at multiple stages following a fraud or scam. There oftentimes need to be some kind of immediate interventions, including, reporting, kind of identifying, what kind of financial supports we can provide assistance with. Safety planning is really essential. And just assessing, right? Thinking to ask questions about things like coerced debt. Which may not be kind of a part of our typical assessment, but how do we include that to kind of see what kinds of financial things were happening in the context of that relationship so that we can better identify resources and a safety plan for them. That might look like assisting them in pulling their credit report because there might be issues that they're not even aware of that might be highlighted in that. And exploring their legal options as well. Identify financial resources that can support them moving forward, things like victim compensation, resources that can help them rebuild their credit, looking at your local domestic violence programs or other resources in your community to see what kind of legal services can they offer. One thing that I think is really unique about advocates and social workers is that we get really good at patchworking resources together. And so we get really creative and think outside of the box about what is a resource that I could leverage here that, may not necessarily address the very initial kind of need or loss, but what is something that could help to complement or supplement what that person needs. So that's going to look different in every community, but we'll have some resources for you at the end as a place to start. Next slide, please. So as we think about safety planning, this is going to be kind of in general what you want to think about in terms of financial safety planning. You want to consider technology and how that plays a role, and digital safety, but it might be doing kind of an inventory of who has access to what accounts, if it's safe to do so. And again, this is going to be really dependent on the situation, but you might be helping assist them in thinking about changing their passwords to certain things, PIN numbers, security questions on financial accounts. And that one I think is really important to highlight because a lot of times, right, those security questions, the answers to those are things that an intimate partner might already know, right? They might know your mother's maiden name. And so we want to be really thoughtful about what we, use as our answer to that question. It could be something that doesn't actually answer the question, but that the victim can remember and know to use so that, they are inadvertently giving access to that account through their partner kind of having the knowledge of how to answer that security question. It might be things like changing beneficiaries on, insurance plans, retirement plans. They might not be thinking of those things. And so as service providers, we might be able to help them kind of think about things that aren't going to be top of mind for them at that moment, but could have an impact later on. Identifying if their partner has access to their accounts. Are they going to be notified if the victim takes action or changes something on the account? Can they dispute any fraudulent charges? One thing that can be really helpful, especially if someone is exiting a relationship, is to set up fraud alerts, credit freezes, ways that they can get notified if their information is being used. We always want to identify kind of a safe place for victims to keep documentation. And one of the things about kind of financial crimes in general is that documentation can be really key to investigating those. And so, keeping really detailed documentation and having a safe place to keep that is important. So that might be like setting up a safety deposit box, a PO box where they can receive kind of mail communications, or they can keep that documentation safe. They can also request copies of their credit report and monitor that. And we'll have some resources that provide some kind of step-by-step detailed information about how to do that. So I think our next slide is going to be talking a little bit about reporting. So I'll turn that back over to Rob.
Perfect. So if you're interacting with somebody who has been targeted and a victim of financial fraud in some capacity, there's a number of different places that you can report. I know there was a comment earlier on in the chat saying that their financial professional, financial advisor, whoever it may be, was potentially involved in moving funds around. And one of the places that you can go to report anything that has to deal with a financial professional is to finra.org. And I will put that in the chat here just so you have it. You're able to file a complaint if you do have concerns about your interactions with a financial institution. Some of the other places you can report to the Federal Trade Commission. If something has an impact to Social Security, potentially, you can reach out to the Social Security Administration's fraud hotline. I know that there's been a number of individuals on here who have mentioned that they've filed police reports. That still is a great place to start. Start with that police report, get the actual physical report that you can have for your files. You can also report if there's something that has happened through an online mechanism. The FBI runs the Internet Crime Complaint Center. That's ic3.gov. You can report concerns there as well. And I know Kim had mentioned, but some of the other things that you consider putting in place, those credit freezes or credit fraud alerts on different accounts. That way you're notified if anything changes with your credit score or somebody trying to open a line of credit using your name. So placing those credit freezes and fraud alerts are helpful steps to take as well. All right, next slide.
Great. So we've kind of talked a little bit about collaboration and coordination, right? Building those relationships with folks in your community. And so this is something I think is really important, particularly in the anti-violence field, because many of us are engaged in some kind of multidisciplinary team already, whether that's a domestic violence response team, a sexual assault response team, lots of other models out there, but most of us are engaged in some form of a multidisciplinary team. And so there are also multidisciplinary teams kind of related to financial crimes, financial fraud. I noticed in the chat much earlier that someone mentioned there's a lot of this kind of education and work taking place as it relates to elder abuse. So absolutely, there's a lot of intersections. And so thinking about how do you combine those efforts, or what are some of the agencies that maybe we don't typically think about in the context of domestic violence response that could be really helpful to include. So we have a list of different kind of agencies that might make sense to build in, right? So that you can think about this in a more broad sense. So thinking about consumer protection agencies, maybe more general crime victim coalitions or other agencies that are seeing a number of different crime types that can help to make those connections. Also partnering with like adult protective services or your area agency on aging, the Better Business Bureau, civil attorneys, as there's been a lot of conversation in the chat about legal resources, and how that can be very difficult to identify. Engaging with civil attorneys in your community, right? And finding ways to partner with them. Maybe there are ways that they could provide some pro bono services for certain situations, or there might be resources like that already in your community. So just thinking outside the box a little bit, and not duplicating efforts, but maybe finding ways that you can serve on an existing multidisciplinary team, or inviting these types of partners in to yours. So I think that's everything on this slide. We can move to the next. And as we mentioned, we have resources for you. So we know this is a lot of information. There are a lot of questions that we can't always cover. And so we wanted to make sure that you have access to additional resources that you can refer back to, and that go really in depth around recovery, kind of a checklist, which is what you see here. We have a variety of different checklists on our website. Some are related specifically to specific types of fraud, identity theft, mortgage and lending fraud. There's really good information in there. I'll add a link to that in the chat. That can be really useful if you're working with someone to kind of, here's step one, what we need to do, step two, what we can do, and provides kind of clear, detailed instructions on what they can do in terms of reporting and moving forward. Next slide. Additionally, we have a more in-depth guide called the Taking Action and Advocates Guide to Assisting Victims of Financial Fraud. And so there's a lot of really good information in there about, one, like how to talk to victims, what kinds of things are helpful to know about the emotional impact, really understanding the different fraud types that are out there with examples. There's also some good information about prevention. We know that once someone has been victimized, they are at more risk for being victimized in the future. And as Rob mentioned, if they're experiencing other types of crimes, that also creates some vulnerabilities that scammers may be targeting even outside the context of their abusive relationship. So things like, if they're dealing with technology abuse, there are a lot of scams out there that kind of exploit like technology support. And so they might be coming across, fraudulent kind of services or things as they are trying to address what's happening in their relationship. And so being kind of aware of what those types of scams are, so that they can be better prepared to kind of, see that as you're sharing out information and resources, kind of knowing what types of information is legitimate and what are potential scams that are out there. Many of you probably get text messages. I know I get them all the time, offering job opportunities, offering, saying that there's a problem with my computer and I need, they need to fix it. Those are typically scams and they are becoming more prevalent. And so there's things that if someone is trying to leave an abusive relationship or they're feeling really trapped, they might be desperate for any kind of information or resource. And so helping them to know, what things are good resources and what things are potentially a scam. So this guide has some really good information in it, lots of resources. And like the checklists, it details step-by-step actions that a victim can take following fraud or scams, and lots of good information there. So I will add a link to that in the chat. And we can go to the next slide after this. Perfect, thank you. One resource that we really like to highlight that I mentioned at the very beginning is our Victim Connect Resource Center. So this is a 24/7 anonymous confidential hotline. And we also run an online resource map for victims of all types of crime in the United States and its territories. And so this is a really great resource if folks are needing access to support 24/7. They can call, text, or chat. We do have services available in English and Spanish, and then we have a language line for other languages. And so this is just helpful to know about. The resource map is a great way for people to find local resources in their community. You can also take a look to see if your organization or your program is listed on there, and if not, there is a form that you can fill out to request to be added to that. And so we just really like to highlight this as an additional resource for you. I think one of the really nice things about connecting with our victim assistance specialists is that they are trained across all victimization types. And so they're really useful. They're really able to identify kind of resources and those intersections between different types of crime. So this is a great resource to know about. And we can go to the next slide.
All right, and here's a few other resources we have available for you all. I mentioned before our partnership with Give an Hour. They do offer a free peer support program for victims of financial fraud and scams. They also have peer support programs for a variety of different disciplines as well. I would encourage you to take a look at their website. Giveanhour.org is where you would find that. And the great thing about this peer support program is it is led by somebody with lived experience. There is a mental health professional who's involved in these conversations, and it's really a safe place for people who have gone through similar situations to connect and to work through some of the challenges that they might be experiencing. So I would encourage you to write that one down, giveanhour.org. There's also a few different kind of one-page flyers on a variety of different topics. So you can see on the slide here, this one's talking about empowerment after financial fraud. All right, next slide, please. Another organization that we partner with is fightcybercrime.org, and they run a peer support program for romance scam survivors. This is a free 10-week cohort where they meet weekly for 10 weeks, and it is run by a licensed counselor as well. And through these groups, individuals who have been victimized, survivors of romance-related companionship frauds, can get together and talk about that healing process, go through some of the ways to rebuild after that kind of a tragic event. So another really great organization, their website is fightcybercrime.org, and I would encourage you to check them out as well. All right, next slide, please.
There's also a few resources from the National Network to End Domestic Violence that I think are really helpful to highlight. They do have an independence program. This helps provide credit building microloans to survivors of financial abuse in the US as a way to help them rebuild their credit. They also have quite a bit of resources, trainings available on their website. They have some great safety planning resources. I did see that come up in the chat. They have some specific kind of financial abuse safety planning resources, technology safety planning resources. So I always direct folks over to their website to get that information. And I'm seeing some folks add some additional kind of resources in the chat, which is great. So that is everything there. Next slide, please.
All right, now we've already shared this link, but FINRAFoundation.org fraud fighter. That's where you'll find our fraud specific content. So there's a variety of different resources that we have available on that webpage, as well as links to any of the research that we've conducted. It's all publicly available on that site. All right, next slide. Wonderful. This is our contact information. So if anybody wants to reach out to myself or Kim afterwards, you're more than welcome to do so. Our emails are listed on this slide here. And with that, I think there might have been a few questions. I think there's a few in the Q&A, and Kim, we can go through maybe and talk through some of those.
Sounds great.
Perfect. So the first one I have here is, what about reporting financial abuse with student loans? So where can you file a complaint? What can you do about student loans? So I'll start. One of the places that you can go is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, cfpb.gov. You can file a complaint there. They would be able to look into your specific concerns. So that's one resource for you. I don't know, Kim, if you have any others that come to mind. That would be probably the place that I would start with.
Yep.
All right. There's another one here where you can go if the abuser is a well-known attorney working with conflicts. That would be a potential conflict of interest or risky. What options are there?
I would start with your local domestic violence program and getting connected with an advocate and having them kind of help you navigate what other resources might be available in your community.
Yeah. You can also check the state local bar.
Yep.
They, if nothing else, might be able to help you find another attorney, or if there is activity that's going on that is not appropriate for an attorney, the bar organization would be interested in knowing that.
Yep.
Let's see what else we have here. Additional resources for victims to get IDs or social security cards, because they may need to leave without all the needed documentation to get replacements.
Again, I would, get connected with an advocate because they will be able to help you navigate that. I think, Anything else you have to add, Rob?
No, I think that's it. And it's tough. A lot of these situations are circumstance by circumstance, so it's hard to give kind of that blanket guidance. But your local experts, the ones that are working in this space day in and day out, would be a great place to start. And then from there, kind of build that portfolio of what you need to do next.
Yep.
All right. See, there's another one here. Personal situation is complex financially, but my spouse has gotten paid for consulting work without my knowledge. Sometime got cash, gift cards. We're in a separated house. Potential tax fraud allegations. How do you deal with somebody like that? I don't have a great answer. I don't know. I would again lean on some of those local support networks that could be there to assist. If there is concerns about tax fraud, you can always contact the IRS, who have agents who would look into those kind of concerns and allegations. All right. So the next one, I don't have an answer for this, but Kim, maybe you do. Do we know if the CDC has plans to include financial abuse intimate partner in the next version of the DV survey?
That I don't know. It would be great if they did, because it's certainly very prevalent, but I do not know if they have plans to do that or not. If anyone does, feel free to add it into the chat.
Perfect. All right. And then this is the last question I'm seeing here. How How does this work for someone who is working with an agency like IRC, whether they are undocumented, seeking asylum due to domestic violence, human trafficking, or some sort of abuse? So, again, I don't have an answer for that one. Again, my expertise is going to be more in the financial space, but I know we have a bunch of experts either in the chat or on here that might be able to provide some specific guidance for that situation. But again, a lot of these that are case by case, they're hard to provide that broad level guidance.
Yep.
All right.
I think that puts us perfectly at time to turn it back over to Patty and your team.
Thank you so much. Wow, a great time management and great presentation, Rob and Kim. Really, many, many thanks. So, thanks to our wonderful presenters and our interpretation team. I also would like to thank my dear colleagues who are behind the scenes supporting this event, Brecon Winters, Fatima Yahoma, and Yvonne Ortiz. And of course, thank you all so much for joining today's session. To learn more about our new resources and upcoming events, please follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And this event was made possible by a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the USA Department of Health and Human Services. So thank you again. Please be sure to respond to our brief survey about our training session. There is a link being shared in the chat and also our QR code on the screen. And we hope to see you next time. And yeah, share your feedback so that we can continue improving our trainings. Thank you so much and bye now.